Hey, everybody. Dr. Jen here. In our first episode, we talked about releasing, subsequent to it, an episode about demystifying gender affirming care. And between the time that we recorded that in November 2024 and as we sit now in early February 2025, a whole lot has happened to impact that particular subject. And it felt like it would be inaccurate and slightly tone deaf to release an episode that did not take into account the reality that we are living in now. So we're taking that episode back to the drawing board. We're going to re-record, hopefully release pretty soon. And in its place today, we're going to talk about a different subject that we think might be very useful specifically in this moment and useful in general. I hope you enjoy. Quick message before we start. We hope our conversations open up new perspectives and new ideas for our listeners, and our goal is to be informative. But we want to emphasize that this isn't a substitute for individual therapy, and we're not providing medical or psychological advice here. If you feel moved by what you hear, and if you want to explore it more deeply, or if there's something in your life you'd like to work on, please reach out to an LGBTQ affirming therapist online or in your area. You'll be glad you did.
Welcome to the Psych Out Podcast, where we find queer joy in demystifying gender, sexuality, representation, and care through the lens of psychological study. And now your hosts, Chris and Jen.
Hey everybody, I'm Chris, and I'm here with my good friend Jen.
Hey guys.
And I am a master's student studying clinical psychology and LGBTQ affirmative care.
And I am a doctor of clinical psychology in private practice.
So, Jen, what are we going to talk about today?
Am I surprising you? I'm gonna surprise you with something. No. We're going to talk about science and the way that science is used to manipulate the conversation about LGBTQ people, and currently a lot about trans people, but the same principles apply more broadly.
Most definitely.
Yeah. And there are two levels on which we're going to talk about this, right? Because there is science as it is practiced, right? The research processes that are used that can give us useful information or manipulative information.
Mm-hmm.
And then there is the science reporting side, where even a very legitimate, well-structured study can be reported on in a way that completely warps what it says. And we have an example for each half of this. So the first half is going to be how to spot some bad science, just bad science. And we've got a couple of principles, and we're going to talk about it like back and forth a bit. We also have a resource if you want it sort of laid out in a more systematic fashion. But Chris, like, what are some of the things you see that is a hallmark of bad science that you look at and you go, oh no, that's not right?
Biases in who the study is on. That's going to be a big feature of the paper that I'm going to talk about, but it comes up again and again, even in like well-meaning science that produces results that are like, ooh, that's encouraging. Often studies will have, they're not going to be easily taken and applied to like a broad group of people because all the research will have been done on like a predominantly white, affluent, like group of psychology students at like one college or a bunch of colleges in the region.
Who are trying to get credit for their Psychology 101 course.
Yeah. So that's a general problem with a lot of research. Yeah.
Can I add to that, though? Like, I think you're right that a lot of it is college student focused, but also a lot of the LGBTQ research is drawn from, and we talked about this, I think, in our first episode, people who are seeking medical treatment and therefore have a reason to respond in a certain way.
Yes.
Or, and this is going to feature in the article, people who are gathered from a biased source with the purpose of getting them to say a certain thing, or people speaking on behalf of the folks that you are trying to draw conclusions about instead of speaking to those people.
Yeah, exactly. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah.
I'll just say, like, this is a tricky topic to bring up because it seems like we all know that this issue of generalizability, that's what we're talking about, is studies and sample sizes.
Can you define that?
The issue of generalizability, can it be applied to a broad, segment of the population? Does this research that may have been done on a very small, like not representative group of people actually say anything useful about, humans in the United States, much less, the rest of the world?
Right.
So generalizability is a problem that most study designers grapple with.
And some don't.
And, when there isn't a lot of money. Yeah. That's a really good way to say what I want to say. Study designers grapple with this when you don't have, millions of dollars. It's always you're never going to be perfect or even especially effective at answering questions about the world or the whole country. Everyone grapples with this except for the people who don't.
Right.
And that is my personal definition of bad science is the people who make no effort to engage with trying to say something that's the beginning of a representative statement.
Yeah. And that comes on sort of both sides of doing the research. And one is really trying to gather a sample of people that is big enough that your conclusions aren't just based on the afternoon that 5 folks had that day, that's big enough, that has enough people. And then also, so I look for that. But then also if they're finishing their study and writing it up and not addressing not only how they tried to do it, but what the limitations are of what they did, if they're not being clear, because no research is going to be perfect. No research is going to be perfectly unbiased. Everybody goes in, and it's a question of not whether or not you have bias, although there's some extreme examples where it is. But generally, it's not a question of whether you have bias, but whether you've made an effort to counterbalance that with the way that you've gone about studying something.
Mm-hmm.
So we've got generalizability. We've got, I mentioned sort of sample size. How many people are they looking at? I will say, okay, there's 2 categories of research that we see in social sciences. One is quantitative, which means you're crunching some numbers, right? You're going to see graphs, charts, numbers, percentages. And the other is qualitative, which still can have some numbers and graphs and charts, but not as much. Qualitative is we went out and had conversations with people and then looked for what the common themes were. And qualitative analysis is still great. It's good, but it's not intended to draw the kinds of conclusions that doing a quantitative thing can, because it's much harder to be objective.
Mm-hmm.
There are tools that they use to be objective, but they're flawed, and they can really mostly be used as a preliminary indication of what other research needs to be done.
Yeah. It's often called work done to develop a hypothesis. If you don't know exactly what question you're trying to answer with your research, a good strategy to do might be to go talk to a community and gather in a controlled research fashion, impressions and experiences, and then look at those themes that are coming up again and again as you talk to this particular community.
Yeah.
This is good science.
Yeah.
But as you'll see, if that's what you're doing, you want to be clear that that's what you're doing, because it's A, a very particular kind of science, and B, it's also not, in my experience, what people think about when they think about a scientific study.
No, they really don't. Yeah. And I think this hints to something that I know you've said before when we've talked, and this is the other thing. You want to be looking for a general tone of humility, that doing good science is actually a very profoundly humble thing to do, because science is not some conclusion that you arrive to, some end point. It's an ongoing conversation that you are having with other people in order to, as a group, get closer and closer and closer to as far to the truth as we can get.
Yeah. I have a good example of this. There was a paper I was reading a couple quarters ago that had really struggled. It was research that was done in 2016 or so, and then it was finally published after many revisions and struggles with the data 4 or 5 years later. And the bulk of that paper was sort of discussing why they didn't reach broader conclusions with the data they'd gathered, and what conclusions they were really prepared to offer based on a very small sample size that they felt they hadn't sufficiently randomized. And ultimately, the paper was just we did a lot of research on mental health apps on phones, and we are prepared to say that people like using them.
Yeah.
It was a positive experience. I'm okay, that's humble. That's great.
Exactly. But I will say, and this is like part of a broader problem in social science publishing, that's not flashy. That doesn't feel cool. That's not as likely to get you, say, tenure at a major university. And we have a problem with people not willing to publish negative findings or teeny tiny findings, and people are looking for the big results. And I think we end up with this like whole system that discourages the exact kind of humility that we actually need to have to do good science.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have a question in chat from our producer who's too shy to say something.
Sorry. I'll speak up a little more.
Yeah, speak up.
It's a good question.
Yeah.
I was thinking when you were talking about like the iteration process and things like that,
Mhm.
if you find a study like particularly engaging, or if you like or dislike its results and you feel the need to verify it, would the lack of follow-up studies be a good thing or a bad thing?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you want to answer this, Chris, or do you want me to?
You answer it and I'll jump in because I forget the word that I'm going to need to use to describe how you do this. I know you know it.
Okay. So you'll get it. So yes, but is my answer.
Yeah.
There are actually amazing resources for that, where you can go on particular databases that will show you who has followed up. And in fact, there's a bit of like a ranking on like how many hits does your paper get because it's cited other places, which is whatever. But you can go and you can see the list and you can follow up and you can see how they talk about the paper. Usually they're not directly aimed at that paper, but you can see that. The problem is, in order to do that, you have to have access to those databases and those papers, which most of us don't.
Yeah.
Right? Even getting on the database and also then looking at the articles in the database is going to be difficult if you're not connected to a university or you don't have a lot of money in your pocket to burn on looking at research, which I don't know anyone who's ever bought an article independently, right?
No.
So yes, but that's a really difficult thing to do. And I don't think most people have access to it.
Yeah. If you do get into the weeds, I mean, that's almost a separate podcast of how to do research with a single study as a basis and how to like look at other studies and try to get a sense of how impactful it is and whether it's been critiqued or, you know, disproven or.
So basically we'll need to make an episode on how to research your research.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, we'll see, because like, I mean, even I don't have the resources and time to do that all that often, right?
Yeah, we certainly could, but that's almost like Chris's How to Be in College podcast. I could teach it.
And that's why we're going to talk about science reporting, because that's what science reporters should be doing.
Yeah.
Right. But there is one thing that you can do if you're fortunate enough to be able to actually look at the paper. And some of them you can, and that is look at their lit reviews section. Look at how much previous research they're basing what they're doing on. And if they don't have a lot of previous research, what is their explanation for why? When you write a paper as part of that like chorus of voices that make up science, the harmonies, the dissonance, all of that, you got to acknowledge that that exists and that your ideas and your thoughts are growing out of organically part of that.
Yeah.
And if you're not doing that, that's a sign that maybe you don't care about what other people say.
Well said.
Right. And the other thing, we'll talk a little bit more about this later too, but the other thing you can see that you can look for are studies called meta-analyses or systematic analyses, which is where people, all they do is they take a bunch of the other studies that have come before and they summarize the results, either qualitatively or quantitatively.
Yeah.
See, vocab, we're using the vocab. And they summarize the results so that you can see what the broad scientific consensus, to the extent that consensus exists, is about the thing that they're studying.
Yeah.
All of these things are not done well in the study we want to talk about. Are you ready to talk about our first example here?
Yes, I am. We're going to talk about a study published by Lisa Littman in 2018, in which she sort of suggests, how do I want to say this? The initial paper sort of attempts to create a new diagnosis. And this may be familiar to some of you or not, but this is a diagnosis of rapid onset gender dysphoria.
It doesn't admit that it's trying to make a new diagnosis. It just makes it sound like a new diagnosis, right?
You unpack that a little bit.
Okay, so the article doesn't set out and say, I would like to propose this as an addition to the DSM. It just creates a phrase that sounds like something that might be in the DSM and that people hear and think is.
Yeah. And that's how this paper comes to our attention, is that people took that phrase and ran with that phrase while it had almost no scientific backing behind it. And it's come up again and again in transphobic talking points online. It's been cited in legislative debates about the rights of trans people and the rights of especially trans youth to access gender affirming care.
A mind-boggling number of times, like just a mind-boggling number of times. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's...
Yes.
Well, let's just jump in and talk about the problems with this study.
What are the worst parts of this study? And I will say, like, there are other studies that have followed that are pretty much just as bad, trying to validate what rapid onset gender dysphoria is. And one of the problems you may have noticed is we didn't define it. And that's because they don't really define it. What on the surface they're trying to say, what they're trying to prove, is that there are a certain number of trans people who really just kind of became trans overnight practically, and therefore we can question the legitimacy of their trans identity or try to treat it differently with whisper conversion therapy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And underneath what they're trying to do is really analyze the causes, quote, causes of being trans so that you can like unravel and undo transness. But one of the things they never do is define what the word rapid means.
Mm-hmm.
Is it 3 months, which is kind of one of the time periods? Is it 3 years? Is it later on in these ROGD studies? They don't even say the amount of time because they've sort of given up on the idea that it's rapid at all.
Yeah.
But in this one, like, that's another thing to look at. Do they define their terms? And do those definitions make sense?
Yeah, they don't. Yeah, they don't define rapid. And I would say the core problem here is that it is entirely by talking to parents, not to people who have gender dysphoria, rapid or otherwise, as the studies, as the study may find it. They're not talking to people who are having this experience. They're not talking to trans people. They're not talking to detransitioners. They are interviewing and pulling data from only the parents. And
right.
Yeah, not just any parents.
Well, and not just any parents. Parents who were recruited specifically through Facebook groups that are already about denying the trans identity of their children. They're like, go to this Facebook group so you can talk together about how your children aren't really trans. And interestingly enough, so this study was not retracted, but like she was forced to do a revision of this study and like post a revision of the write-up. And there were a number of reasons, but one of the main ones was to actually come clean about how biased these sources actually were. And if you read the write-up, it's a little bit defensive.
Mm-hmm.
You see what she's putting out there. And yeah, this was a sample that was primed to give the answer that the researcher was hoping to get. One other thing about that too, though, because we talked about this in our very first episode, is remember the difference between looking at experience and defining experience from the outside in instead of from the inside out. We're going back to when we talked about how gender identity disorder, which was an old diagnosis, was mostly defined by what you on the outside would see someone else is doing versus gender dysphoria and the way we try to do diagnosis generally now, which is your experience and how you report it.
Yeah. And the bias that I see when I read through it is that there's a very strong bias in favor of, or purporting to be in favor of, the older form, the more established form of diagnosing gender dysphoria in young children, where even to this day, the criteria for how you diagnose a pre-adolescent child with gender dysphoria is clinicians take reports from parents about the observable behaviors of these children by and large. There's much less of a focus on asking the kids how they feel. I mean, that might come later in an assessment process, in a gender affirming care process for a young child. There can be a lot of that. But in terms of initial diagnosis, there is
a lot of that.
There should be when it's done well.
Yeah. I mean, when it's done well, it's all about helping the child learn how to express themselves as effectively as possible.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the Littman study is coming from a place of deep skepticism, I feel, that there's any value to the diagnostic criteria as they exist for adolescent gender dysphoria, adolescent and adult gender dysphoria, because
yes, very much so.
When you look at those diagnostic criteria, it's all about, well, talk to the adolescent, talk to the adult, let them tell you how they feel about their gender, about their experiences in life.
Yeah.
And Littman went out and studied a group of parents who were deeply distrustful of their children's self-reported experiences of their life.
All right. I could spend all day ripping apart this particular study. And there are some great articles out there that people have done that are more long form, explaining things that are wrong with the study. But just to transition to the second half of what we want to talk about, now we've talked about, and is there anything else you want to add about how awful this study is before we transition over to the next topic?
No, because I could go on.
Yeah.
But as you were saying, there's a lot of good work that's been done about it. But I find people are still unfamiliar with, this idea, or they might be familiar with the transphobic idea that transness is a social contagion. That starts there with Littman. We should have mentioned that up top.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
yeah. I mean, that starts there in the sense that it coalesces in scientific language.
Thank you.
What people were already thinking. Yeah. But the other thing we talked about, right, is this is bad science, but it's also been reported very badly.
Yes.
And that is the second part of the problem. Remember, we said it's been used in state legislatures dozens of times with nobody sitting there and going, wait, hold on, this is not a good study, right? And what we're going to talk about in our second half is also how good studies can be reported so badly that they end up saying to the public the opposite thing, the exact opposite thing than what their conclusions actually say. So after a break, let's talk about the second study that we want to evaluate here.
At LGBTQ Evolutions, we know that change starts with people like you. Every act of kindness, every dollar, and every moment of your time brings us closer to removing the barriers that prevent our friends and family from being themselves. Together, we can create a brighter, more compassionate future for our community. Donate today with the link below.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about, we're back.
We're back.
I have to say, there is a little bit of joy or pleasure in taking a sledgehammer to some of the studies that have been used to hurt us and hurt our community. And also, it's just kind of fun sometimes to pick apart bad studies. Yeah. There's a whole book on that I will maybe link called Bad Science that does exactly that. But also, you can have really good science that is reported very badly. And there's one big example of a study that also has been used in so many legislative debates and discussions and so many articles, transphobic articles, that they say, this is the way that the reporting is, this article shows that gender affirming care and specifically surgery, although I think they expand that beyond the actual realm of the article itself, but gender affirming care makes people worse, makes people depressed, makes people suicidal. That's sort of the way that they say it. And this is a study, and I'm going to butcher the name of the lead author here, okay? It's Dejna et al. And et al. Is just a fancy way of saying Dejna and a whole bunch of other people. And it was published...
Dejna and at least two other people.
Right. Oh, so precise with your APA citation style. Look at that. So...
yeah, I'm in that land.
Well done. So this was published in 2011, and I'm going to, from now on, call it the Swedish study so I can stop butchering your name. But it has been so misused that the lead author has had to go on to various platforms in order to try to debunk the way that this study has been warped. I've never seen a researcher have to give a Reddit AMA, and that happened. So this study was done on a very long-term cohort. It's we would call it a longitudinal study of people who from 1973, I think is the date, all all the way through like 2002 or something, came into a clinic and got gender affirming care. And it's a long-term follow-up of measures like suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, depression. And here's what the study actually shows and what its purpose was.
Mm-hmm.
Surgery alone isn't good enough. We need to do better by providing support around mental health or social context or all of the things that we talked about in our gender affirming care episode. If we just say, here's surgery, but we're not going to offer you anything else, now go out into your life. Some people will thrive and many people will, experience horrible transphobia and be very depressed about it.
Mm-hmm.
What it's saying is this is only one component of the way to help people live whole lives and the justice of what we as a medical system owe to people when they come to us for help. So what they did was they compared these outcomes not to trans people who did not get the care. They compared them to people who were not trans.
Mm-hmm.
Because they wanted to show, look, there's still a disparity, even though there was an improvement from before the surgery to after, a significant improvement.
Yeah.
So you can see how they took the absolute opposite, which was we should provide more and better gender affirming care, to looks like we should just scrap the whole thing.
Yeah.
Which, if I was that researcher, would be so wrenchingly painful to see happen.
Yeah, it must be so frustrating. I mean, in some sense, it's difficult to...
Yeah.
I have not read this paper. I actually was not familiar with it until Jen and I started discussing it. But I imagine it's difficult to quantify it. Like, Here is the intent of the paper. I mean, You can say that in the beginning of your paper, and you can talk about it in the section that many papers have where they discuss their findings. But if somebody skips and they're just looking at the math...
Right. Yep. Or skims the abstract.
Yeah, skims the abstract. Then, you sort of opens it up to people's biases of like, oh, something doesn't work well.
Yeah.
Oh, then we just shouldn't do it at all. And like, that's
right.
That's a value judgment that, good science. That particular value judgment is not one that seems very scientific to me, I'll say.
For sure. And I do think that there's another impact of this, in addition to supporting unscientific decisions at the legislative level about medicine. And that is to make it upsetting and scary for researchers to do this kind of research.
Yeah.
And I don't know, because I don't have evidence over whether that has had a chilling effect on research, and I sure hope it doesn't. But wow, how painful.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I do want to kind of flag some specifics, though, about how to look at science reporting and realize as somebody on the outside that they're warping what they're talking about. Because if you didn't know that and you just trusted the person talking, you'd be like, oh, wow, this study says blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
So one is, look, they're citing a single study, which, like we said, science is a chorus, not a solo.
Mm-hmm.
Another is if you hear sensationalized language, the way that it's being talked about does not have the hallmark humility that we mentioned that should be, and generally speaking, when it's working right, is part of science. But instead, and we see this all the time in the media about ridiculous stuff, says something huge and absolute and usually very shocking and contrary to accepted science.
Yeah.
And then you look at the article and it's extremely exaggerating what the article is saying. So if you hear something that sounds earth-shattering, or that your gut is what? Or too good to be true, that's a sign that you should probably check up on your sources. And if you can, get a little bit more information about whatever study is being cited.
And I'll tie that into what we were saying in the first part of the episode. Something that most studies struggle with is their ability to be generalized to a large number of people. So anytime you see a headline that says that's just saying people blankety blank because of this study, that's a big red flag for me.
Right.
And I mean, this study seemed like something that would have to have some money behind it because it was longitudinal. It was looking at people over a long period of time. That's very expensive to do the follow-up. And yet its findings were, pretty measured, even though it did have resources and could be a little more generalizable. You're asking a very small question.
The other thing, too, as we talk about this, I remember back when BuzzFeed was a thing, they would have these listicles that would say things like, what science says about gender. And first of all, like, science doesn't say. Science is not one unitary voice that can say a thing. And I know nobody took it literally, but science is not a person. Science isn't God. And then they would do in the listicle like a single study for each thing.
Yeah.
So again, this fundamental misunderstanding of what science should look like and sound like.
Yeah.
Right.
Science can't say anything with a unified voice.
Right.
But also, a lot of the science that we rely on to support gender affirming care is backed up by a consensus of many, many, many voices who have done many, many studies.
Right. But you know what? That makes a terrible listicle.
It makes a terrible listicle.
That's not good clickbait.
Yeah, it's not good clickbait.
Yep.
Something we didn't mention in the first part was like, is this paper being written by somebody who has expertise in this field?
Yes.
Has the author of this study, the lead author, worked in this field before? What is their background to evaluate the data that they're seeing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do they know what they're talking about?
Yeah, do they know what they're talking about?
And I don't remember. Yeah. And I don't remember if I said this about the Littman study. Maybe I did, maybe didn't. The discussion section that cites other articles is 2 paragraphs long.
Yeah.
The lit review section. And that is wild. That is so small. Oh my gosh. If I had turned something in like that in grad school, like I would have been flunked. Anyway, the last thing that I do want to say for me before we just briefly talk about some resources is there are some inherent limitations to doing research on this population as on other populations. And one is you'll see even in one of the resources we want to give, and this gets used in rhetoric trying to discount all of the scientific consensus around gender affirming care too. You need a double blind study. And if you don't have a double blind study, it's not legitimate. And a double blind study has to do with classically giving some people the pill with the medicine and some people a placebo pill, and not knowing which one is getting what, and then seeing what happens. And that is only ethical under very narrow and specific circumstances. And it is not ethical when the only options are don't give treatment and this person's mental health spirals out of control into disaster, and or give the treatment that we've had before, which is essentially conversion therapy and is going to make them worse. That's just, so you have to have different research designs, and studies that do not have double blind setups or even don't have blind setups can still be good and useful so long as they talk about the limitations of their findings.
Yeah. And it's difficult to blind these studies at all. I mean, you know, if you're looking at trying to give a placebo versus giving a hormone treatment, the hormone treatment has observable effects.
Right.
You cannot like trick someone.
Right. Wow, all these people's voice dropped. I wonder why.
Yeah. So that changes the experience of the person who got the placebo. If they know they got the placebo, then they're having a different experience.
Right.
And that's something that comes up in a lot of areas in psychological and psychiatric studies, I find. It isn't really talked about.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so anything else we want to add before we talk just for a minute about some resources to learn more about this topic?
No, I think we should move on in. Okay,
so 2 things I want to direct your attention to. One is the book that I mentioned before called Bad Science by Ben Goldacre. It is just fun. It is, remember I said there's like a certain joy to taking a sledgehammer to studies that are attempting to manipulate you. Right? This is the sledgehammer, and it's incredibly entertaining. So it's a great book. It's available pretty much wherever you would buy books. If you can buy it somewhere other than Amazon, thumbs up to you. So that's a resource. And then the other resource that I have is a website. And I will say I'm not personally endorsing everything on this website or the organization that it's from because I don't know enough about them. And I'm not on social media, so I can't check their Facebook or X or whatever. But they have just laid out 12 things to look for as indications or signs that you might be looking at either bad science or bad science reporting. It says Spotting Bad Science, the definitive guide for journalists. And it lays it out really well. It's really useful. Like I said, you have to read it with a grain of salt because not every study is going to conform to all of the expectations that we wish that we could have in ideal circumstances. But it gives you the words to say, oh, no. This study has like a small sample size or is not generalizable or all of those things. So we're going to link that in the description. And those two tools will help you immunize yourself against bad science. Oh, wow. I'm using a vaccine metaphor. How appropriate. Immunizing yourself and giving you the ability to speak in a way that is clear and is accurate as to why those studies are bad. And that is helpful both for your own heart and for the people around you whose misinformation you might be able to identify and correct.
Yeah. This reminds me, we're talking about science reporting in this part of the episode, and the ecosystem of how science reporting gets done is really under challenge and has been for a long time now.
Yes.
It's in personal opinion. I don't think it's something that the press has ever really done well in my lifetime, but especially now, news outlets understand that there's an audience for, fun, exciting titles that make general claims about studies, but these outlets often don't have dedicated science reporters. They have reporters who are trying to churn out, 10, 20 articles a day on deadline. And they're the kind of people who need these resources.
Yeah.
Often when you're reading science reporting, it's not written by a dedicated science reporter unless you have a site that you go to specifically for that. And often if there is a specific science reporter on staff, they're a generalist.
Yeah.
And they're trying to give their general understanding of how to read these studies and, apply it outside of whatever field they may be most expert in.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know what? As you were talking, I was about to do some bad science reporting here for a moment and then caught myself because when I was researching this, I was looking into what are scientists saying about bad science reporting. And I looked at, I think, 3 or 4 articles. And in my head, I was going to say, I saw numerous articles in which ... And like, that's another sign of bad science reporting, right? Is if it's really vague language. What the heck does numerous mean? You hear significant thrown around a lot too. What the heck does significant mean?
Yeah.
It has a very specific statistical meaning that really doesn't help us know how anything manifests in our actual life, but also it's just super vague, significant to who and how. But so I almost said numerous and look, I caught myself. Okay. So I saw 3 or 4 articles with scientists just bemoaning the state of scientific research and the fact that we don't have a good standard for what science reporters should be doing and how to do it, So yeah, also that's one of the things that's happening is it's just kind of the Wild West and it doesn't work super well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are editorial biases too. And more, actually, as news outlets get consolidated and purchased by wealthy people who have certain certain agendas for things like trans healthcare.
Yeah.
It becomes an outlet for the billionaire class. Right. So, not to be conspiratorial, that's just what we're seeing happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, these are some ideas for how to spot bad science reporting. And also just hopefully if you're listening, you can get some validation by shaking your fists at the universe of the ecosystem of news media. I will say I do try to frequent websites that I find are reliable in alerting me to research that is being misused. Right. I will notice when research comes out, but I don't necessarily know how it's being used in legislatures and do a really good job of analyzing them. And there are some that are really good, specifically aimed at the Littman Report. And we can also link one of those evaluations. All right. So I guess that's what I have to say. Anything you want to add, Chris?
No, I think we covered it.
Okay. All right. Okay. So just as we close, and boy, I've been thinking about the timeliness and the emotion behind this project. We are developing and launching a program called LGBTQ Evolutions.
Yes, we are.
And it is designed to give affordable but high quality therapy online for clients currently in California, because that's just our sphere of influence right now, and licensure. But to access people in remote areas, to make sure that they're getting therapy from people who have training and experience working with LGBTQ clients, especially trans clients, to pay a living wage so that they don't have therapists for 6 months and then the therapist moves on, right? Most of the time. And then to do affordable, hassle-free surgery letters. And, we're doing this in a way where we will not be vulnerable to the kinds of threats that we're seeing done against other programs when they're getting funding from various government sources. And we're not going anywhere. We're not backing down. So if you feel inclined to check us out, see more about what we do, that would be wonderful. We'll link some information also in our description. Anything about that you want to add, Chris?
No, I think you covered it. Website is coming soon. We'll link what we have now. Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's a big part of, what you and I have been working on together alongside this podcast. And I'm excited to share more information about it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening. I hope you got some useful tools or at least some entertainment out of this episode. And we will be back in a couple of weeks with a new one. All right. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Psych Out Podcast. For more information on today's subject, information about our charity, or to find our Patreon, check the links below. Join us next time to learn more about the psychology of who we are.
These are difficult times. We know that some of you out there are suffering so much that you might be thinking of ending your life. If you're having thoughts of suicide, please reach out to professionals for help. You can go to an emergency room, call 911, or reach out to the hotlines we have linked in this description below. I know that many of us have had bad experiences in medical settings, but there are people, many people in this field who want you to live. Please reach out for help so that you can find them. We want you around for our next talk.